Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this year's Virtual Fair Housing Conference. Our next speaker is Dr. Jessica Louts, who is the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights at the National Association of Realtors. Her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Dr. Lotz has received several accolades, including being named a Riz Media Newsmaker and one of Housing Wire's Women of Influence, which is a list of the 100 most influential women in the housing industry. Dr. Lotz received her doctorate of real estate from Nottingham Trent University in the United Kingdom, and she holds a master's in public policy from American University. Today, she'll be speaking to us about the data relation between race and home buying in the United States. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to you. And once again, I'm so thankful that you're able to share this information with us. And she just informed me that this information just came out today. So we're really excited to keep you guys up to date on this type of data. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm excited to join the South Carolina Realtors today as well. So I am going to be going over the latest and greatest research that we have just put out. This is actually now an annual study that we have been doing. It's the third iteration of this report, actually. So it's really excited to be able to share it with you all first and really be the first people that I've talked to about this data. So what this report does is it looks at not only the homeownership rate on a national level, but it actually breaks it down on a state level by race as well. What's really exciting in this year's report is that we actually were able to look at the cost of rent compared to income within local areas as well. And so this really becomes a really helpful data point when you think about how hard it is to save for a down payment today and where people receive their down payment. So maybe that's friends or family who are helping out. Maybe that's savings, or maybe that's tapping their 401k. From that data, what we also in this report do is we actually look at successful home buyers, people who purchased a home in the last year, and what their experience in housing was, because it's vastly different when we look at this based on race. Of course, everyone acts independently. These trends are trends overall that we're seeing, but everyone's behavior is such an individual decision as they go through life. So I am going to be giving you broad strokes here, but I do think it's helpful when we look at the housing market and when we look at homeownership and we think about this on based on race as well. So let's dive in. When we look at the homeownership rate gap, what we can see is that it's actually, from the face of it, looks pretty encouraging, but I'm going to give you some bad news here. While we can see these trend lines are all trending upwards in the last year, and the homeownership rate has gone up in the last year, what we actually know is that the gap based on race between Black Americans and white Americans is actually increasingly growing. So while it's trended upwards, it just has not trended upwards at the same pace when we look at this by race. I will say encouraging signs here. While we have seen the homeownership rate go up overall, if I'm going to pull out the Hispanic Latino homeownership rate, we can actually see it's above 50%. That happened for its first time. So that's pretty encouraging. When we look at this gap that we continue to see, we often cite the gap between white Americans and Black Americans, but we also cite the gap between white Americans and Hispanic Latino Americans. So seeing that trend upwards, that's an encouraging sign as well. What I do want to go into is that the gap that we see today, the gap overall is as wide as when the Fair Housing Act started. So when we think about all of the history that we have here and the work that the housing community has really done to try and make that gap smaller, it just hasn't materialized. So let's talk about some of the reasons why, but let's first look at this on a state level. When we look at South Carolina overall, I'm going to break this down on a map for each race. So if we're looking at South Carolina and we just pull out that data, what we can see is that the homeownership rate for white individuals within the state is 79%. That's incredibly high. It's higher than what we see on the national scale. When we look at the homeownership rate for Asian Pacific Islanders within the state, what we can actually see is it's at 69%. So a little bit lower, but still an incredibly high rate when we think of this in comparison to what we see on the national scale. The next thing that we can do here is look at the Hispanic homeownership rate. It's at 58%. So again, higher than what we see on the national scale, incredibly encouraging when we think about the state overall. Some of this has to do with affordability, but we know that there's actually a lot of people moving into the state, and that is driving up home prices in the state as well. When we look at the homeownership rate for Black individuals within the state, it's actually at 56%. That's one of the highest than what we see on a nationwide scale. So that's incredibly encouraging. When we look at the homeownership rate for Black individuals, what we can actually see is that it is higher traditionally in the South than in comparison to other states. So I'm going to pick on North Dakota. I'm guessing there's not many people from North Dakota who are listening in. But if we look at that state in particular, we can actually see an apples to apples comparison that the homeownership rate for North Dakotans who are Black is just 9%. So again, in apples to apples comparison, we can see some pretty big differences there between 56% and 9%. The other trend that I would pull out is California. We know that California is incredibly expensive. We actually know that California has a lower homeownership rate overall, and some of that has to do with housing affordability. It's just difficult to be able to become a homeowner in that state. And so unless you have that household wealth to build on to be a repeat buyer, or perhaps family wealth that you can rely on, it is quite difficult to be able to purchase a home in California, regardless of race. But 37% is the homeownership rate for Black individuals within the state of California. So now I want to go and I want to transition into some of the buyer demographics. What I think is really important here is to look at the experiences of individuals who actually entered homeownership in the last year, because that can tell us a lot of information about how these experiences differed, how their finances differed of individual buyers, and then how they encountered the housing market. So let's take a look at some of this data. And again, these are from successful home buyers who did purchase a home in the last year. When we look at this data, what we can see are some pretty big differences here. And I'm going to walk you through this chart because I know there's a lot of data on here. What I'm doing is parsing out the differences between successful Black buyers compared to white buyers, compared to Hispanic, Latino, and compared to Asian buyers. I want to pull out some really big differences that we have here on this chart. The first one is the blue bar. So if we compare the blue bar overall across the line, what we can see here straight away is that for Black buyers, they are more likely to have student loan debt. In fact, they are doubly likely to have student loan debt as Asian buyers, and they are nearly doubly as likely to have student loan debt compared to white buyers. What that means at the end of the day is that you're going to have less buying power, because this student loan debt is going to be one more payment that you have to make, and it's going to be difficult to enter homeownership when you're saddled with that debt. We also know that Black home buyers actually have a higher student loan balance. So that's just going to hinder them more as they try and save for a down payment and get their debt to income ratio in check. The next one that I want to pull out is single female buyers. I love the storyline of single female buyers. It's one of my favorites because single female buyers, regardless of race, they are a powerhouse in the home buying market. However, when we look at this, what we know is that single female buyers, they traditionally buy with a lower household income than married couples because it's one income. And they traditionally buy with a lower household income than unmarried couples, again, one person, and as men. So if you're just a single man compared to a single woman, apples to apples comparison, one adult, what we know is that single women traditionally make less. So you're just going to have less buying power. And if a third of Black home buyers are single women, amazing. But that's going to be more difficult to enter into this housing market where there really is an affordability crisis. And when we look at the amount of competition for each home that's out there, and there's a bidding war, it's going to be more difficult for that single woman to compete. The next one I want to go to is first-time buyers. So what we can see here pretty quickly is that when we look at all minority races, that there is actually a bigger share of first-time home buyers. That's a good thing. There's lots of first-time home buyers who are trying to enter into this market. It's quite difficult. But what we do see is that overall, the first-time home buyer share has actually been quite low, historic lows. And so we know it's quite difficult for a first-time home buyer, again, to be able to enter into this home buying market, to compete against perhaps investors who are out there. And if we know that there's more minority buyers who are first-time home buyers, that's just going to be doubly hard for them to compete in this home buying market and be able to say, can I stand up against this investor who's able to pay all cash when I have a low down payment? I'm really trying to eke my way into the home buying market and I want to be a homeowner. It's going to be quite hard. The next one I want to pull out is multi-generational home. And I want to take a little bit of time on this one. Now, what we can see here again is for all minority buyers on this last bar, this light blue line, it is more common for all minority buyers to have a multi-generational home compared to white home buyers in the buying market. On one side, this could be incredibly a good thing financially because you could have an older adult, perhaps a young adult who's living at home, and everyone's contributing to the mortgage and to housing costs, and they're all financially contributing. That would be a very positive sign, and that could be very helpful in perhaps buying a bigger home in a nicer area that perhaps that family couldn't afford before. And you have each other as a support system as well. So lots of positives from that scenario. On the flip side, it could be a very big drain on perhaps throwing out there a single mom with a single income who's supporting an elderly relative who's retired and is not working and financially and providing the caregiving support for them as well. In that scenario, that could be a really big financial drain on that family. And so thinking about just the need and the size of the home to have multiple generations within that, of course, we're talking about a larger home as well, that perhaps is more expensive. So as we look at these dynamics, we can see and parse out some of the hindrances that could be holding back, especially Black home buyers compared to white home buyers. The next thing I want to go and talk about here is down payment source. So I think this is a really important one when we think about entering homeownership. How in the world are you going to scrape together the cash, especially when home prices are going up so dramatically, and they have been for such a long period of time? So in this low inventory environment, we do have bidding wars. We have a lot of buyers who are competing against one property, and they're throwing their hat in the ring. So I even take my husband's cousin who's been calling me incessantly this week because he is one of 6 bidders on this home, and they're finally got it. They have their closing date. It's a very exciting moment. We're going to have champagne on Friday and celebrate this. But what we know is in this bidding war environment, you have to pull your down payment source from somewhere, right? So when we look at this for first-time home buyers, like my husband's cousin out there, what we know is that for first-time homebuyers, it's even harder because you have to pull from your savings. You have to scrape together that cash. You're not gaining that equity that repeat buyers have in this market. So if we know that minority buyers are more likely to be first-time homebuyers, what we can see here is that they're going to have to rely on savings more than other buyers out there. So what we see is that Asian homebuyers, especially, relying on savings. The other thing that we can say is past equity. So of course, if you're a repeat buyer, you can pull that past equity, which is more common for white home buyers out there. 401k, this is an important one. We know that home prices have gone up dramatically. So we know that there's a lot of wealth in the home buying environment or in the housing market right now. And if you're a homeowner, you're doing quite well. There's a lot of buyers out there, unfortunately, that need to tap their 401k or their retirement savings to be able to enter into these wealth gains that homeowners have. What we know is it's most common for Black home buyers to actually tap their 401k. It has become more common to actually use any type of stock market gains or anything along those lines and actually cash out those stocks to enter homeownership. One of the things I would say here is that especially for first-time home buyers, they're likely to diversify where they're getting their down payment because home prices have increased. So they have to diversify these different sources. One of them is family. So the biggest population that we do see using family as help here is actually Asian home buyers. We see that 1/4 of them use down payment help from friends or family. It is common among first-time homebuyers today to have that wealth transfer and to be able to use family to help them enter homeownership, but that is a source that is not available to all people out there today. The other thing I want to talk about here is rejection from mortgages. So in this report, we do have a couple sources here. So this is looking at nationwide data, and this is looking at primary residence buyers. So it's not looking at investors. It's not looking at someone buying a vacation home. It's only a primary residence and it's nationwide. I'm just going to show you a couple stats. So that's why I'm really being particular about this one. What we can see very quickly on this chart, though, is that the denial rate, even for successful home buyers, is higher for Black home buyers and it's higher for Hispanic home buyers in comparison to white home buyers and Asian home buyers. This becomes really important because if we think about that denial rate and just walking away and saying, you know what, I'm discouraged. This has been a rough day. I am going to go back to my rental unit or go back to living with mom and dad. It's just not for me. And they're discouraged and they walk away from that home buying process. What they may not realize is there is a different lender out there who may be able to help them, maybe with a low down payment program, maybe able to help them qualify for that FHA loan that perhaps they've written off. So I would say that really talking to potential home buyers out there who have been rejected in that process and saying, here's my list of amazing lenders who can help you through this process, that I think is really helpful in this process. The next thing I want to give you is just based on your state, and this includes both refi and it includes purchase loans. So we're looking at the entire market of denial rates in South Carolina. And what we can see here pretty quickly is just comparing Black individuals compared to white individuals. Again, the same pattern here trails, where the denial rate in South Carolina is 35% for Black individuals. And this is, again, purchase and refi and all types of purchases, compared to 14% for white individuals who are applying for mortgages. So again, a different, we're not comparing apples to apples here, but I do think it's important when we pull out the South Carolina data, because again, there's conversations that can be had regardless about those denial rates as well. So the last thing I want to say here is just looking at the typical South Carolina renter and how many individuals could actually afford to purchase a home. So we actually have a map in the report looking at this as well. And this is looking at the typical home. And in South Carolina, what we know is that there are 37% of renters out there who probably could afford to jump into the buying market, compared to 57% of white individuals who are renters right now. Why does all this matter? This is where I'm going to leave you. This is not new data. This is really old data. It's supposed to be updated this year. It's updated every 3 years from the Federal Reserve. And what's important here is that homeownership really is net worth. It's where we get our savings. It's where we really have our wealth in this country. We're traditionally really bad savers. And so this is our nest egg. And when we look at this, what we can see is the same patterns of homeownership rates are trailing the exact same patterns of net worth. So when we look at this by race, what we can see is that for the typical white family, they have $188,000 in net worth, compared to the typical Black family that has $24,000 in net worth. For Hispanic Latino families, $36,000. I would expect that all of these numbers probably trended upwards in the last 3 years, just as the price of homes increased and the equity that families have in homes has increased. But for those who are left out of the home buying market, for those who are unable to enter into the home buying market and are not homeowners, they're going to have this, unfortunately, be left behind on these wealth gains that homeowners are seeing. So that is all that I have prepared, but I do appreciate the time to share this new data, and thank you all so much in South Carolina for having me.